Okay, so every episode so far has been about my family: a name, a parish, a marriage record, a land title, but this one's a little different. But stay with me because I promise it circles back. So I finished a book this week that I haven't been able to get out of my head rounds, and I picked it up because I wanted more context before my trip to St. Elizabeth next month. And it ended up doing something I didn't expect. Give me my background that I was looking for. It changed the question I'm asking about my own tire. Because the more I sat with this book, the more I realized it isn't a detour from my family story at all. It frame story sits inside. So today, I want to walk you through what's in it and why I think every Jamaican family researching their own history needs to understand this. The book argues something I wasn't fully prepared for, that the British monarchy wasn't a passive bystander to slavery. It didn't just look the other way. It funded it, guided it, protected it for hundreds of years. Here's where it gets super interesting to me. The book traces how the crown deliberately expanded royal sugar consumption to help normalize it as a British household staple, turning something that had been a luxury into an everyday item on the table, in the tea, in the pantry. That normalization manufactured demand, and that demand manufactured a need for enslaved labor to meet it. Capitalism first, racial hierarchy came in afterwards to justify what capitalism required. That order of operation matters. It's not simply that Britain decided one group of people were inferior and then figured out how to profit from that belief. It's the reverse. The profit came first, and the belief was built to protect the profit. And here's another little detail I love. There was real resistance to this inside Britain itself. Women across the country organized petitions and rallies against the slave trade. And that's a piece of this I didn't know. And I want to pull on the thread more in a future episode because it's not a story we often hear. The abolition movement gets flattened into a handful of famous white guys in Parliament. And the reality is that it was so much wider. But across the Atlantic, there were Jamaican landowners that were depending on that racial hierarchy for their entire economic survival. So they fought to keep it in place. And if you've been watching this series, you already know how deep that hierarchy ran. In an earlier episode, I talked about Jamaica's legal system for racial reclassification, the actual legal mechanics that decided who counted as white, who counted as free colored, who counted as enslaved, and how much that status could shift a family's fortunes. And that system didn't exist by accident. It existed because the plantation economy needed it to. It wasn't Queen Victoria who first proposed ending slavery. That was her predecessor. But obviously that plan came with a catch. Formerly enslaved people would serve an apprenticeship, 4 years for skilled and domestic workers, 6 years for field workers. On paper, this was framed as a transition. In practice, survivors described apprenticeship as, in some ways, worse than slavery itself. The same forced labor, the same lack of control over their own lives, just with a brand new name attached to it. And because Britain's legal system had racial hierarchy built directly into its infrastructure, nobody being freed had any guarantee the crown or their former enslavers would actually follow the new law. It was Queen Victoria in 1834 who finally said enough. The enslaved will be free. So there's this case, Somerset v. Stewart, 1772. James Somerset was an enslaved man held by Charles Stewart, a customs official. Somerset escaped in London in 1771, was recaptured, and was being held on a ship bound for Jamaica to be sold back into plantation labor. His godparents petitioned the court of King's Bench for a writ of habeas corpus to challenge the legality of holding. On June 22nd, 1772, Lord Chief Justice Mansfield ruled that colonial slavery had no grounding in English common law and ordered Somerset discharged and set. By the 1700s, Rulings like this had helped produce a real free Black population in England itself, separate from Jamaica entirely, built out of the constant back and forth of British families bringing enslaved people from Jamaica to England and sometimes back. And that's the detail that really got me, because it means this was never really two separate histories, England and Jamaica. It was one system running in both directions at once. People, money, and law all crossing the same ocean over and over. It also means I can't fully separate the Englishness of it all from my research anymore. When I trace a name like Blake or Headley or Newman through a St. Elizabeth parish register, I'm also tracing a decision that was made in London, in Parliament, in a courtroom on the other side of the Atlantic. What strikes me most, honestly, is that I don't think this was ever really about race at the core. I think it's about money and control, and race became the mechanism that made both possible. When I look at my own family's decisions in colonial Jamaica, I see the same pattern underneath them: survival first, shaped by fear and laws that were never written with us in mind. Every choice I've traced so far in this series, who married whom, who was recorded as free, who owned land, and who worked it, sits inside that same pressure system. And that's really what I'm sitting. My family story is not unique. Mine is a version of a pattern that's repeated itself across thousands of Jamaican families, all making survival first decisions inside a system designed in London and enforced on the ground. The more records I read, the less this feels like my family's history, and the more it feels like a history, one I happen to be tracing through my name and through my book. And I think that's actually the point of doing this kind of research at all. It's not to make my family special, but to understand the machine my family was living. Context means so much. So next month, I am headed to St. Elizabeth, mostly vacation, part pilgrimage, to walk where my family walked. And in prepping for that trip, I learned something that's gonna reshape how I read every land record from here on. So Jamaica's parish lines were not fixed. Manchester Parish didn't exist until the 19th century. It was carved out of St. Elizabeth and Vere, and land in the Northwest that had always been recorded as St. Elizabeth became Manchester almost overnight, which means some of the records I've already shown you in this series, Blake land, Newman land, Mitchell land, the parcels I traced through the Santa Cruz Mountains and Pedro Plains, may need a second look under the parish they were actually recorded in at the time. It's a good reminder that boundaries drawn by colonial administrators weren't just lines on a map. They can quietly erase or relocate a family's paper trail without anyone meeting, but then we weren't meant to be. So that's where I'm at this week. A book that started as background reading turned into the frame for everything else in this series: the sugar, the capital, the law, the courtroom in London, the parish line in St. Elizabeth. It's all one. More soon. I've got a stack of 18th century British abolitionist books queued up, and I'm reading them now with a different question in mind. Not just what happened to my family, but how England and Jamaica built each other, one law, one ledger. If you're tracing your own Jamaican family history, I'd love to know, has this back and forth between the two countries shown up in your record? Drop it in the comments and subscribe if you want to come to St. Elizabeth with me next. I'll see you on the